Welcome everybody to the show with my guest, Temple Stewart. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing good. This is fun. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. And for anybody who did not see our first one, I would definitely recommend it. We definitely got into the backstory of kind of how you arrived where you at today. Also went into the education. I want to touch on the education again a little bit, just because that's super fascinating to me. Like I've had the good fortune of being able to cover most of the academic spectrum, like anywhere from PhDs in the field to MDs to RDs to people who got masters, and everybody has a very similar answer when I ask them, what was the difference between when you came out of school and learned all your stuff and kind of the philosophy that you have now with it?
Yeah. And you know what? I think that the overall arching theme, because I hear the same thing, right, is one, everybody needs to be very particular in who they choose to listen to when it comes to clinicians, PhDs, dietitians, all of it. Because if your doctor, dietitian, whatever, stops learning in school, you are going to be at a huge disadvantage, right? We are only taught so much, and the research is so behind, especially for dietitians. It's like 20 years behind when it comes to what's in our actual textbooks. I say that to say, I would just encourage everyone to make sure that your clinician is up to date and is a continual learner. If you don't have a continual learner as your provider, you're going to be, like I said earlier, at a huge disadvantage. And this goes all the way across the board. And so we need to bring back critical thinking, right?
100%. And so I did an interview with Dr. Philip Ovadia. And for anybody who hasn't heard it or doesn't know who he is, he's a cardiac surgeon. And he was getting out of his residency in the early 2000s. And this just gives an idea of how one-sided blinders we can have with education. When he just had to pick his specialty, he's like, cardiac surgeon is calling me. I want to do cardiac surgery. And I forget whether it was his professor or mentor or a combination of the two, looked at him dead in the eye and was like, don't do that. That's a dead field. We have statins. We have solved heart disease. You don't need to do that because you're going to be out of a job. Right. And now, fast forward 20 years and you're crazy. We don't have enough cardiac surgeons. And he rephrased that. He's like, it's not that we don't have enough cardiac surgeons. We have too many cardiac surgery patients.
Yeah. It's shocking. And to say that statins have solved that problem it's almost laughable. But yeah, it's true. It's you hear all these things about people getting replaced and all these medical technologies, yet we're still the sickest we've ever been. So that's a good statement, kind of laughable in a way.
So first I'll touch on, you're in a schooling program right now, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going back to school to be a naturopathic medical doctor and NMD. So yeah, I'm in my third year. It's great. It's more root cause driven. So it's all about, instead of just throwing a pharmaceutical at someone, it's figuring out, okay, well, why is their cholesterol high in the first place? Or why do they have high blood pressure in the first place? Or, why are they struggling with infertility? So it's the approach that I've always practiced in my career. It's just allows me a much larger scope in terms of using pharmaceuticals if I need to, but more so herbs, supplements, and figuring out lifestyle dietary changes to help the individual figure out, okay, well, what's stemming or causing this problem in the first place?
How does this education differ from the education that you got when you were doing your RD stuff?
Yeah, it's just so much more proactive versus reactive. So when I was taught as a dietitian, it's all okay, this patient has XYZ. How do you treat them with what diet? And that's great. There are some uses for that. If someone has a bowel resection or whatever, that's where they need that, or a TPN or something, they absolutely need to have a dietitian on board helping them out there. But the problem begins so much earlier, right? Most of the time, medical issues start, like I already mentioned, in early young adulthood or whatever. And it's we do such a bad job at prevention that it's you wouldn't need half the medical things that we go through if we could stop these diseases from progressing so quickly in the first place. And so as an NMD, it's really focusing on, okay, let's try everything in our power to fix this via natural ways, whether it's homeopathy, acupuncture, massage therapy, diet, lifestyle, movement. I mean, I could name a zillion therapeutics that we use, but it's all about treating that individual in a way that supports the body's own natural healing versus introducing some exogenous source or extremely invasive thing like a surgery, right? And so a lot of these things have their own risks and side effects when you talk about conventional medicine of like, okay, this individual has ulcerative colitis. Let's just remove their whole intestine. And it's like, okay, yeah, but now they're going to have extreme issues with malabsorption, digestion. They're going to have to wear a colostomy bag. Like it just gets so invasive and so risky, and it has a lot of cons. Whereas naturopathic medicine is really about supporting the body and supporting those own innate healing modalities, which the body wants to do, right? We've all seen it. Anybody in this space has their own kind of story of healing in a way. And so that's really what natural medicine is all about, is like, okay, how can we support the body, whether it's replacing something that's missing, whether it's getting rid of something that's doing harm. That is the whole purpose, is, okay, your body is amazing and it wants to heal. Let's just get it in the environment that it actually can versus, sending them to the hospital and having their whole colon removed. Or I could give 100 different examples, but that's the purpose, is support the body because it wants to heal and it's amazing in doing so.
So how do you think we got where we are? Right. And I've asked this a bunch. Do you think and this is a really interesting one, because I've heard anything from like the far off conspiracy to, we didn't intend this to be, it's a bunch of little lies, right? Is it because we were faced with so many issues that we're like, hey, we need to like cookie cut something. Like we got to find a way to make this mainstream so we can do the most good while still being like seen as many people. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Totally. Yeah. And I think it's multifactorial. I think because I try to believe the best in people, I like to think that it didn't start off maliciously in terms of wanting, bigger profits or whatever, those kinds of things. I think it has turned into that in a way. I think that's all across the board, by the way. I don't think that's just with dietitians or just with pharmacy or just with physicians. I think it's the entire healthcare field. It doesn't matter if you're PT, OT, speech therapy, whatever, you can see the demand for profit. I don't always think that that's bad. I'm lean towards capitalism in general. I think where we get into trouble is one where we have consumers looking for a quick fix. So I do think there is some ownage on the patient and the customer themselves. I think that a lot of times people come to the doctor and they want something that works immediately. Give me a pill that's going to work today. Fix this today. I am not willing to do the work. I'm not willing to change my diet. I'm not willing to change my exercise habits, anything like that. So I do think there is some ownage on the consumer themselves. But I do think the system has gotten so convoluted from the top when you look at research biases, when you look at where the money's going, when you follow big pharma, when you do all these things, it starts to be a little bit eye-opening. And so I think there's multiple factors of how we got to where we are now. Ultimately, I think it comes down to one, there needs to be some sort of reform, whether it's particular laws and in the system itself. I think insurance and all of that needs to be reformed. But I do also put some responsibility on the consumers themselves. When I was in the hospital, one thing I noticed is people weren't really willing to give dietary and lifestyle changes a chance until they had a significant event. And what I mean by that is until they were getting their toes cut off because of diabetic complications, or until they had a heart attack or stroke. Then they wanted to come around and say, okay, well, what can I do now to prevent this from happening again? And so I do think education in terms of like, hey, you got to start like 20 years before to prevent these big events that are happening. So I think there is responsibility on both sides. I think on the clinician side, but also on the actual healthcare consumer of like, we've got to switch our mindsets. We've got to start working on this from the minute that we learn about it, from young adulthood, and start there. And then also we need a different mindset with our clinicians themselves of, hey, we can't just keep throwing quick fixes. And obviously sometimes that's necessary, right? If you have somebody that's, really needs a conventional medicine treatment, of course, do it. It's life-saving. Conventional medicine is life-saving. But in terms of long-term disease prevention, we just need to have a mindset shift, and then also remove all of these external things that are pressuring research to go in one way, or pressuring people to recommend one treatment over the other when it comes down to money. And so that was a really long-winded way of answering that, and it has absolutely zero solution. But I think there's a lot of things feeding into the place that we're at now, and I think there's a lot of things that can be done.
I completely agree. It's something that I would see in fitness, right? Like you would see people who clearly needed to lose weight. Like that was the most common one, right? They had complications. They had a heart attack. They had, they were diabetic, whatever it was. They clearly needed to. But it was so hard to convince people to actually put the work in. Right? Like, I don't know how many times somebody would sign up. They're all motivated. Like, they have to. Like, they just went to the doctor and the doctor said, hey, if you don't do something, you're going to die in 10 years. Right? And so they come to the gym, they work out for a week, and then they're like, yeah, it's just too hard. And then they just stop. And so part of me thinks that we have this in medicine, and this would be cool to run like studies and see statistics on it. How many times does somebody come back, right? Like, how many times does somebody actually adhere to something? And are you doing more good, like doing whatever you can the first time, right? Like, so if my mindset is I'm going to see somebody and I'm going to see them one time, right? Like, the stats are that, people may have 1.2 visits, whatever. I'm just making stuff up. Am I in the best interest to at least do something right now versus, hey, we're going to try and put you on a long-term plan, knowing that 95% of you are just going to throw it in the trash the moment I leave?
Yeah, and I agree with that. Like, there's some instances where it's like, okay, this person's got stroke level blood pressure. Like, I'm not letting them walk out of my office without putting them on some hypertensive med, right? So totally. And I think too, I don't know if you've ever read the book, The Comfort Crisis, but I highly recommend it for people because I think one of the biggest issues with humans in general is we just want to be comfortable. We're very rarely faced with things that make us uncomfortable. So I think some of these things that we're talking about, changing your diet's hard, getting active is hard. And so when you have the option between those things and a pill, the vast majority are going to pick a pill, right? And so I think some of those things need to be addressed as well as being willing as a clinician to have a hard conversation with your patient of like, okay, here's X, Y, and Z solution that we can do now. But for long term, I really want you to understand that this has a risk. You're better off if you change your diet, fix your movement, all of that. And so, yeah, anyway, I think the Comfort Crisis does a really good job summing up kind of the mental aspect of why people do this kind of phenomenon. And yeah, that's another mindset shift that I think is really important for us to talk about and get on board with.
100%. I think it's spilled over into other disciplines. Like, we pretend science is settled, right? Like, and that's why I love the story from Ovadia. Like, they were convinced heart disease was settled science. Like, this is what has happened, right? Like, we know, like, scientific fact. I was talking with Dr. Bickman, and it literally, like, I was like, if there's one thing that I could strike from people's vocabulary, it's this like idea of scientific fact.
Yeah.
And it spills over into every discipline. And now and so I tell my story. I went to a dermatologist and I had some blood work done, and the dermatologist was like trying to talk to me about a statin. I'm like, I don't think you're it, buddy. And it wasn't even a dermatologist. Like, he was a PA of dermatology. And I'm like, and had I pushed it, and I don't know, maybe they can, maybe they can't, I might have been able to walk out of a dermatology office with a statin prescription. Like, so it just kind of like spills over, and then we end up with this, oh, it's settled, right? That's settled science. Like, cholesterol causes heart disease. You need to be on your whole grains. You need to eat all this and blah. And then everywhere people go, they're inundated. Well, my dermatologist says this, and then my cardiologist says this, and then my, chiropractor says this. I think it's just really hard, like, to convince people that it's not as scientifically like settled as people want to make it believe.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's also why we need like a zillion more PhDs like Dr. Bickman, because he's extremely humble and he's always questioning, and I've heard him say like, if this comes out that we were wrong or whatever, great. Like, I want to keep moving forward, and so and maybe that wasn't him, but that mentality is important, right? We question everything. And if you look at science in general, like, we really know nothing. Like, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but especially with nutrition, like, we know very little. And so just to have anything that's like hard fact and people are like willing to go over their grave, arguing over a lot of this stuff, I agree. Like, we need more people that are humble and are willing to continue questioning no matter what biases they contain, no matter how it profits them, etc. Which is why I like Dr. Bickman so much, is we could use like a million more to really get to the bottom of things. Same thing with like the gut microbiome. It's like, we think we know a lot. We know nothing about the gut microbiome. We know nothing. And so I just think that having a bit of a bit of a humble approach would be helpful in the scientific community. And you see this on Twitter or X or however you want to call it. It's like some of these people just will argue until they're blue in the face. And it's like, but we really don't know that much. We're all out here doing the best we can.
Yeah. And one of my favorite things from Bickman is every experiment, every research, every study that you do, you should be trying to prove yourself wrong. He's like, that's what science is. He's like, and then the longer I can go without being able to prove myself wrong, the stronger my theory now is. Like, and I know that, right? Like I took microbiology. I did, where they give you a petri dish with 3 bacterias and they're like, you've got to spread them out, right? Like you got to make out your chart. You've got to grow them. You have to isolate them. And then at the end, you have to tell us what it is. And that's what you do. You keep running tests to try and eliminate stuff or prove that it's wrong. And then at the end, you're like, well, my only plausible explanation is that it's this. Now, I didn't do great on it, right? But it's the whole theory. And since then, like I'd kind of lost that, right? And every research I read, I swear it's people just trying to confirm the bias that they went in with.
Yeah, no, totally. And one way that I kind of, take this into my own practice is everybody is so individual, and the way that we treat people should really be so individual. What works with somebody may not work with another. And I think being willing as a clinician to hear them, like listen to their story, understand what they've tried, what they haven't tried, etc., and be a little bit moldable when it comes to your protocols, your dietary prescriptions, all of that. I think, it just goes, it goes a long way when humility, like going back to that with scientists, with clinicians, with the whole gamut of people that are involved in health. I think a little bit of humility is helpful because like we just keep saying over and over again, we just don't know. And like you said, experimentation, working with people is the best way to kind of get there.
So given that we are in this politically charged climate, and we're not going to talk politics, I don't care. We have this movement, right? This Make America Healthy. And some people think efforts are going to be misguided. Some people think that they're right on the money. As somebody who sees this literally every day, like you are inundated with people who are having chronic issues.
Yeah.
What do you think are some of the things that are plaguing us as a whole, like not necessarily the individual, but as a country, as a society, and some of the changes that we need to make in order to be healthier?
Yeah, totally. So first and foremost, the movement around food, I love it. And while I don't prescribe to every conspiracy theory out there in terms of what's going on with our food, additives, all of that, I think it all needs to be questioned because there is seriously something wrong. And the people that go and argue about this and say, oh, nothing's wrong, people just eat too much, I genuinely have a really hard time understanding that frame of mind. There is something wrong with our food systems, et cetera, the additives, what we're in, what we're being exposed to. So I don't care who does it. I don't care if you're Democrat, Republican, Independent, Libertarian. I don't care. Like, question the whole thing because there's something that's not right. Women are sick, men are sick, children are sick. I don't care who does it. I don't care if you're a liberal. I don't care if you're a raging conservative. Figure it out. I don't, and so like the questioning that has come across from this Make America Healthy Again movement, I'm very pro for it because something is off. I worry about the health of my children. And that's the biggest thing for me is like, I went through the worst health as a young adult. And I want to prevent that with my children first and foremost. So I don't care what political side you lean on, question the whole thing, figure out what's going on. We need a whole revamping of the way that we look at these things, the regulations around them, who gets what, special treatment, etc. Number one. So I would definitely say food. I would definitely say big food, all of these processed food companies, they all need a good questioning. Second, I go into endocrine disruptors. And this is something that I have become more passionate about in the last 2 to 3 years, just because I think it was the icing on the cake for my own health journey. Fixing your food's one thing. Doing lifestyle, building muscle mass, that's fantastic. The icing on the cake was, for me, was when I realized, oh shoot, I'm rubbing all this crap all over my body and it has 17 different chemicals that I can't pronounce and don't know what they cause. I'm breathing in air. You know, we live in Phoenix. Like the air here is horrific. The tap water here is horrific. I'm doing all these things. Am I working against myself? And so I would really say, you know, the chemicals found in plastics, pesticides, personal care products that mimic and interfere with our body's natural endocrine systems also needs to be questioned. This is especially true for women and children. I mean, men too. Y'all are struggling with your testosterone all around. Not you personally, of course, but everyone, you know. And so that is the second thing that I'm really loving that's coming out of this movement is like, okay, what are we being exposed to? And I think we have, again, barely scratched the surface of the harm that a lot of this stuff does. And I don't want to come across as like, the sky is falling, like panic every day, have high anxiety around this stuff. But I am encouraging people to change what you're doing as much as you physically can to be in control of some of this stuff, especially if you have little ones or you want to conceive, etc. Because I do believe that a lot of the health stuff is either being caused by some of this stuff that we're being exposed to, and it's certainly being worsened. So that's my little rant on the Maha movement. Again, I do not care where it comes from. I don't care if this would have been a liberal or a Republican, whatever movement, whatever. I am very pro questioning all of this stuff that we are being exposed to because something isn't right, you know? And so anyway, I hope that answered your question. It might have been a little bit more passionate than you were asking for, but
No,
it's a good thing.
Yeah, that's right in line. And I think my thinking has changed over the last 6 months. Because so many people, and part of it is the absolute pushback from social media in general. And it can broaden to healthcare, but you tend to hear about the people on social media, right? They're the ones with the loudest voices. But you have people with millions of followers who are vehemently on there, you know, drinking Diet Cokes and saying seed oils aren't bad and the dose makes the poison and red 40 is not bad. And so when I'm thinking about it and you look at research, we try to get so technical with it and we try to isolate, right? Well, no, in studies with, you know, when we looked at this one single preservative, this one single food coloring, it wasn't a problem. Like you would have to eat so much. And part of me has, like, my mindset has changed. Okay, well, what if it's not glyphosate? What if it's not red 40? What if it's not artificial sweeteners? What if it's the fact that we have artificial sweeteners and glyphosate and red 40 and preservatives and issues in our water and issues? What if it's all of that? And yes, the dose makes the poison, but we're being poisoned by 1,000 different sources, and we are now at the situation we're in.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that's one of the biggest issues when I hear people screaming, like, show me a research paper. Where is that on PubMed? It's like, okay, but there's no research paper that takes an individual and combines all of these things in one and then studies every possible factor that you can see. But we do know autoimmunity is through the roof. We do know cancers in young people is staggering. I mean, it's staggering, and nobody seems to be concerned about that and all these different things. And it's like, I completely agree. You take a jar, you fill it with little micro doses of all these different poisons that we're exposed to, and you wonder why the environment is so sick, and you wonder why this jar is just so dirty and gross and sick and all these different things. And so, yeah, I completely agree. And this is my biggest qualm with the social media world and a lot of these really big clinicians on these platforms who are like mocking the movement and mocking even like the whole crunchy mom thing when they were going after the crunchy moms and they were just mocking the moms who like are genuinely just concerned because they're worried about their children. I mean, talk about like angry. I don't think I've ever been that angry because it's like you guys are mocking these women who don't have a degree. You're calling them out for that and all this other stuff because they're legitimately concerned about their children. And to me, that's disgusting. And to me, if you're going to do that on a public platform as a clinician, there's no shot I would ever see you or trust what you have to say because your ego and your pride is gross. And so I don't think there is absolutely anything wrong with the questioning that's going on right now and the concern that's going on right now. You take 2 seconds to look at this health statistics, and I don't care what GLP-1s have come out, what statins have come out. all this other stuff, it's still tremendously bad. Like it's still tremendously bad, the state that we are in from a health perspective, from a mental health perspective, you name it, there's nothing we have really improved on. And so, yeah, it's just, the other thing that really got me a little bit fired up, and I'm going on a bit of a tangent here, but that big health kind of movement that happened in the Senate, and there was a lot of influencers. It was like Food Babe, Max Lugavere, all the people that we kind of all run in the same circles with were there, and they were advocating on behalf of the people of like, hey, we really want reform. We really want to know what's going on. And then the dietitian community, and sorry to go off on my own profession, but this was so angering to me. I'm in a bunch of like private practice dietitian groups on Facebook. And the dietitian community is over here complaining, why weren't dietitians invited to the round table? And it's like, you weren't invited because you don't have an influence. Your views on this are so narrow-minded, and you can only look at one research paper at a time. I ended up probably leaving 15 of these groups on Facebook. I was so annoyed with it. And it's like, you guys, man, like this whole medical community around this and calling this a movement that is a waste of time, or quack science, quack doctors, all this other stuff is just, it's unbelievable to me. And I've said humility about 50 times on this podcast already. Like, let's get some humility on board, people, because we do not know, again, we don't know anything, and something is clearly wrong. So I don't know, maybe we could all just take like a step back and look at our pride and our ego and see like, okay, is this driving some of the decisions we're making? But anyway, that's my little tangent on that. I was so frustrated to see some of these healthcare communities going off and sounding off about that roundtable in such a way that it was like, yeah, you're embarrassing yourself. You probably shouldn't have put that on Facebook because they're advocating on your behalf. So anyway, sorry.
No, you're totally fine. Do you follow Greer McGinnis?
I think so. It sounds familiar.
So she's a registered dietitian that specializes working with children. She's out of Long Island.
Okay.
I interviewed her a couple weeks ago, and she just said the same thing, like almost verbatim about the Facebook groups. She's like, I'm in a couple like dietitian Facebook groups, and she's like, it's ridiculous. And I don't know if I don't understand from a dietitian standpoint, because nobody's coming to take your job, right? Like this, it's not like you are a statin manufacturer and they're like, hey, let's get rid of statins. It's not like you're a food additive manufacturer and they're like, let's get rid of food additives. It's not even like, you are still going to have a job. Just, we're sick. I think the worst statistic I saw was 93% of Americans do not fall under the category of cardiometabolically healthy.
It's probably higher, but yeah.
Which is unreal.
Everyone.
Yeah, it's so, and like some statistics that I kind of went through, and the reason I think we need to do something, and I don't care what it is, we need to do something. Obviously, processed food is on the rise, right? Like processed food started when the tobacco companies started buying big food companies. That's just a matter of fact. Over 70% of our food supply in America is ultra-processed food. And for people who are like, people get confused with ultra-processed versus processed. Ultra-processed, you can't make at home. Like you do not have the ingredients or the ability to make this food at home. That is ultra-processed. 70%. Okay. Well, now our diabetic rate is through the roof. Like, and not just, we're seeing a few more cases. We're talking like tripling rates. Our heart disease, while everybody will tell you that our rate of death from heart disease is going down, our actual incidence of heart disease is not going down. It's following our population trend. So we're still having heart disease. Cancer is through the roof. And the problem with cancer is younger and younger. Like that was the thing. It's terrible. That was the thing when I was talking to Ovadia. He's like, it's not necessarily that I'm operating on that many more people now. It's that the people I'm operating on are younger and younger. He's like, it used to be I'd operate on the 60 and, late 60s and 70-year-olds. And then I started operating on 50-year-olds. And he's like, dude, now I'm doing 30. Open heart surgery on 30-year-olds.
Yeah, it's shocking. It's scary.
There is something wrong. And it's not an education thing. Like, we're more educated than we've ever been. It's not an exercise thing. Yeah, we move a little bit less, but we spend more money on health and fitness than like the top 8 countries combined. It's not like lack of information on social media. We're over consuming, sure. But that's, eating 400 calories more a day is not going to turn into all these issues. What's the thing that's changing? Our food.
Yep. Our food and our, I would argue, environment as well in terms of exposures and 100%. And stress levels too. Like we've never been this stressed, where the news, the politics, everything is so stressful. Women are being forced into the work, which I work. So I'm not saying that women are trying to do dual mother and work, be CEO. It's not working clearly, like for some, and for seasons maybe, but I just think there's so much that we're just not, our bodies were never meant to handle, and that we're being faced with as technology explodes and all this other things, but we're clearly paying a pretty big price for it. And the worst thing for me is, like, it's one thing to have my own health issues because I had them. It's another thing if I start to see my children suffer. And that's just not something I'm willing to be silent about on social media or anything else. Like, I'm not willing to let my children get harmed if it's something that I can help.
100%. And I think one of the greatest discoveries that will come from all of this is that your social life, like the environment that you are in, is going to have quite possibly the single greatest factor on health and longevity. And I think
100%.
blue zones are a scam. Like, I've done videos like those are just a wild scam.
Yeah.
But if you look at regions where people do live longer, they just have a different lifestyle. Like, it is just different. And that's the only way to explain why we are 60th in the world in life expectancy while having access to stuff that nobody else in the world does. Yep.
Isolation, loneliness. The big C word definitely didn't help with any of that. You shove people in their homes, don't let them go out, all that. Yeah, it's a wreck. Get some good friends. Have some friends that care about their health. You'll add light years to your quality of life and your timeline for sure.
Absolutely. So a couple things that I wanted to ask you specifically when it comes to women's health.
Yeah.
Because I feel this is where the whole calories movement, and it's just eat more, eat less, move more. This really frustrates me because that's great for me as a mid-30s healthy dude. I can eat whatever I want. Like, I understand where some of these people are coming from. It works for me. We're all the same. It has to work for you. Until I meet women who have PCOS or are perimenopausal or menopausal, and all of a sudden, what would absolutely like crush it for me is not working for them.
Yeah.
Why? Why is it so much different? And if I hear one more person say men and women lose weight the same way, I'm going to.
Yeah, it's crazy. Tell me you know nothing about hormones without knowing nothing about, that is bad. But, I think it's important to understand, one, to begin with, women are on essentially a 30-day hormonal cycle, whereas men are on essentially a 24-hour one. Not only that, but women have an orchestra of hormones, whereas men are more like a one-man band. No insult by any means. It's just the differences in how we were created. And so I think a lot of that plays into this effect, right? And so, like, just a brief rundown of like the cycle for someone that's reproductive age, and we're starting to see a lot of problems with this. PCOS is the number one cause of infertility globally, and it's largely dominated by insulin resistance. But when you look at the female cycle, essentially it's broken up into 4 stages. The menstrual, which is your actual like bleed, we call that day 1. It's like the winter of the cycle. Cramps, all that, big focus on iron, vitamin C, B vitamins. And then essentially your insulin sensitivity increases because of the low hormonal levels. And so, light exercises, all that. Follicular phase is day 6 through 14. We call it the spring. You have a little bit more increased energy, better mood. This is a good time to lift heavy weights because you tend to have kind of rising hormone levels that make that better and easier. Ovulatory phase, obviously this is like superstar phase. So this is where like you feel the most confident. You're actually proven to be a little bit more attractive. Your face symmetry is really equal. Like, it's a good time, ovulatory. And then you have your luteal phase, which is going to be like the week before your essential bleed week for the next round of this. And this is a whole month, right? So women like expect to feel good the whole month. And it's like, no, your mood's going to shift. your strength is going to shift, your insulin sensitivity shifts, which a lot of people don't even realize. You typically have high insulin sensitivity during your follicular and ovulatory phase, and then it goes down and then kind of picks back up. But anyway, long story short, we tend to major in the minors is a good way to say it. And we focus on these like little things without realizing, one, insulin's a huge driver in almost every single effect of all of these different hormones. So when you have insulin that's off, you can expect a mess down below. And so this is the number one endocrine issue that I see in women that are struggling, and definitely number one in terms of weight loss. And so I can go into the effects of insulin resistance on the cycle if you want me to, but I would say, okay, yes, I will. Again, back to what I was saying, it's the number one issue that I see. So first and foremost, when you have insulin resistance, and this can be with people without a PCOS diagnosis, I want you to understand that too. This is your typical like, hey, I'm like getting a little flabby in the belly. What's happening? You may not even have it high enough to cause the PCOS, but still listen in because this is important. One, when your insulin's high, you're going to create androgens. Androgens are created because insulin stimulates your ovaries to produce more. And so this disrupts your entire cycle. I see a lot of like fad stuff on social media that's hyper focusing on estrogen and progesterone and cortisol. Yeah, that's all fantastic. If your insulin's screwed up, the whole thing's going to be jacked up until you fix insulin. And so people really focus on like, oh, grind up flax seeds and do all these things. That can be helpful. If you let insulin and blood sugar go out of control, it doesn't matter what you do below. Insulin is still going to pollute your river of hormones. And so increased androgens is the huge one that I see. So insulin stimulates excessive androgens. Androgens are just kind of what you think of your male pattern hormones, although they're very present in women as well. This is going to cause the irregular periods, the decreased ovulation. It can stop ovulation altogether. And then you're going to see estrogen progesterone disruption because insulin affects the liver's production of SHBG or sex hormone binding globulin. And it essentially throws off this delicate balance that you have between estrogen and progesterone. So this is what's going to cause people to have like the lighter periods, the heavier periods, the painful periods, etc. Thirdly, you're going to have increased fat storage. So obviously insulin drives fat production in a lot of different ways and fat storage in a lot of different ways. And then it's going to cause inflammation, right? And so you're having these fat cells that are going to secrete inflammatory cytokines that causes all kinds of chronic disease long-term as well. And so these chronic levels of high insulin and this hyperestrogenism or too high of excess estrogen without progesterone essentially will also cause the uterine lining to become really thick. And that's where you get your endometriosis. So it's all of these problems that are all a lot of times linked to the polluted river upstream, which is your high insulin. And so I see this often. This is like a growing problem in reproductive age women, and people are having all these problems with their cycle. And it's like, okay, well, we've got to fix it upstream. And, nowadays the solution for most conventional medicine is, oh, we'll just take birth control. It's fine. Like it'll just stop all of this. Yeah, it'll stop all of it because you have no hormones essentially at that point, or they're messing with them. And so anyway, I say all that to say my soapbox around this topic is you've got to fix insulin first. You've got to look at cortisol as well, because those two can sometimes go hand in hand. One drives the other, et cetera. And then look at your cycle as a like beacon of health. And a lot of women want to suppress it. They don't want it. They want to ignore it. But it truly is the window into your health. Fertility is a window into women's health. And so that's my whole thing. If you want me to go into the actual cycle phases, I can. There's a lot of different recommendations that we can give around that just by how you feel and changes. Yeah. Do you have any questions on that kind of in terms of like, I want the focus to be on insulin itself?
Lastly, like before we run out of time, what are things people can do to help their insulin, right? Because insulin is such a big problem. And I've heard it from everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. So first and foremost, I would say the diet is number one here, as your audience probably knows. Like the biggest change and the number one thing that will fix insulin is getting rid of this simple carbohydrates. And this is very true for women as well. There's no difference here in terms of the effect. So really focusing on your proteins. That's the number one macronutrient, period. No questions asked. Protein is it. A lot of people try to like overcomplicate protein and fat. When you eat protein, you get the proper amount of fat. So like, don't think too hard on it, And so I say protein first, non-starchy vegetables second. So I'm pretty pro vegetable if the person tolerates it, doesn't have autoimmune disease, etc. So I like non-starchy vegetables, salads, squash. The things I do kind of caution are your ones with high oxalates, obviously. But so focus on that. But protein first, non-starchy vegetables, and then of course fat. So cooking with butter, tallow, those kinds of fun things. Olive oil is fine if you're using a high quality and not heating it up to a zillion degrees as well, in my opinion. And so that's kind of the biggest thing. The other thing that's important is just making sure you have enough muscle mass. So this is a very common thing for women to not want, which I don't know why. It's a very like, I don't want to get bulky. I don't want to make myself look bigger. When in reality, that's not it at all. You're not going to look bulky. You're not going to look bigger, but muscle is your best friend when it comes to glucose metabolism. And if you don't have muscle, you're going to struggle with glycemic issues the rest of your life. And so I would really highly encourage people to stop fearing building muscle, especially women, and do it. Build muscle, get strong, get toned, and have that muscle mass available to use glucose appropriately, because it's going to make you a much, much more insulin sensitive. And this is especially true as you enter peri and menopause, right? So those hormones naturally decline in those ages anyway. So it's even harder to keep up with muscle. So I encourage people, do not get sedentary during that age and stage of life, because your muscle mass will decrease and your hormones will decrease. And now you're just in this wreck of insulin resistance, and that is going to cause a lot of problems. And so hyper focus, if anything, on muscle mass and building that lean muscle mass during peri and menopause, because it is your best friend and best anti-aging longevity hack in the book, of course, in combination with those dietary changes, kicking the carbs. I mean, I just don't know how else to say it. A lot of people get weird about carbohydrates. I'm not scared of carbohydrates for your average, very insulin resistant human. They're usually pretty fine depending on your activity levels, etc. But the reality is like you said, the statistic in the beginning of the podcast, 93+% of the population is not handling carbs well. And so we got to do something about that first. And so manage carbohydrates strategically. High protein, high fat, lots of non-starchy vegetables. If you tolerate them, you like them, whatever. And then muscle mass. That's kind of the two biggest. Of course, there's intermittent fasting as well. I'm a fan of intermittent fasting, but that's my spiel.
Yeah, I'm similar with carbs. I love when people are like, you're afraid of carbs. I'm like, no, I just feel better without carbs.
Yeah.
Like I can eat carbs. Like I just don't find any benefit to basing them around the majority of my diet.
Same, 100% same. I'm not scared of them. I don't think they're inherently quote unquote bad. I think we overuse them. I think we overeat them. I think a lot of carbs are way bigger than they were ever intended to be, like fruit. You look at the history, we have bred and genetically modified fruit to be massive. And so when our ancestors ate a banana, is like half the size of your pinky finger, and nowadays it's like as big as your forearm. Like it's huge. It's like way too much fruit and high sugar, high starch, all that. So I think there's some of that stuff going on. I think they're also cheap, right? And so I think a lot of people lean to carbs because that's what the restaurants push. It's cheap. You can get a massive bag of rice for like $9 and you can eat for a year on the same bag of rice, And so like, it's those kinds of things that have made us lean towards carbohydrates more. Protein has been more expensive. And so I think that also plays into this a little bit as people, we're all kind of strapped a little bit in a way. But anyway, yeah, that was a little bit of a tangent too, but I agree. I don't think they're inherently bad when used appropriately and when also you're getting good, high quality, sources.
And I think the funny thing about, we look at individual carbohydrate sources and go, well, they're not as expensive. And you're right, they're not. But nobody just eats plain rice, right? Like you have a sauce with it and then you have something else with it. And then, so when you actually start totaling up all of these things, it actually is not, because then I eat a bowl of rice and then I'm hungry again in 2 hours. Like how many times have you been to a Chinese restaurant and you power through and you're like, I just ate so much food. And 2 hours later, you're like, so who's hungry again?
Yeah. And women are particularly sensitive to these responses too. I remember when I was really struggling with PCOS, I would go, like sushi was a thing. In college, we'd all like go to this one sushi restaurant in this little small town and we would just eat ourselves sick of sushi. And it was just like you said. And an hour later, I'm like, what is wrong with me? I just ate my body weight in sushi. And now I want to go have something else. Like something is wrong. Like all I could think of was like, how am I hungry? I literally ate so much, and it's women, especially women that are dysfunctioned in terms of insulin are going to have that. That's why binge eating is so prevalent among women with insulin resistance. Binge eating, and even if you're not diagnosed binge eating, but you could sit down and eat, a half a box of cereal, that is because of your hormones. That's oftentimes not as much as a discipline issue as it is like an insulin resistant is driving you to those behaviors. And it's horrible. I remember the feeling of like, this is something's wrong with me. Why am I hungry? How can I sit and eat a box of cereal and still function like a normal human being? Like, this is not normal behavior. And I remember beating myself up about it. Like, why am I hungry? Why do I need to eat this? Why can I not put down these simple carbohydrates? And it's because women's hormones are so sensitive to changes and so sensitive to external stressors. And especially when that females are in that resistant state, it's really hard. Discipline's one thing, but overcoming it is it's a challenge.
100%. Well, Temple, I really appreciate you coming on.
Yes.
Every time I'm pretty sure we could just do like a 3-hour podcast. But so where can people find you? I would highly recommend everybody follow Temple, especially if you're female, but just in general, like a lot of good information from the non-crazy dietitian side of the world.
Yeah, hey, that's an honor because some of them out there. Yes, I am on everything as the.ketogenic.nutritionist, literally Spotify, TikTok, Instagram. And if you guys have any questions on anything that we've talked about or you want clarification, whatever, shoot me a DM. I try to be as responsive as I can nowadays on social media. But yeah, I'm happy to be here and it's always an honor.
I appreciate it. And I will link all of Temple's stuff down below. I appreciate everybody who tuned in and we will see you guys next time.